There are lives the world never notices, and there are lives the world cannot stop looking at. But the hardest life to understand is the one that is seen constantly and still never truly heard. Timmy Whittaker lived inside that contradiction. A man whose image traveled across millions of screens. A man whose smile became instantly recognizable. A man who, even in full view of the world, remained almost entirely untranslated. So the question is not what people saw. The question is what they missed. Because what most viewers remember is simple. A face, a softness, a smile that seemed to appear again and again, regardless of what surrounded him. And that smile became the story. It became the shorthand. It became the explanation. But it was never the truth. Because a smile can be many things. It can be warmth. It can be habit. It can be response. It can be protection. And sometimes, it is the only signal that passes cleanly between a person and a world that does not understand anything else about them. Before the cameras, before the commentary, before the assumptions, Timmy existed in a place that did not resemble the environments most people call normal. A date road that did not lead anywhere important to outsiders. A home that carried the weight of time, neglect, and improvisation. Rooms that held more history than structure. Air that felt heavy with repetition. And routines that had been repeated so long they no longer looked like routines at all. To someone arriving from the outside, it would feel like collapse. To Timmy, it was continuity. And that difference matters. Because people often confuse discomfort with absence of meaning. They see conditions they would not tolerate and assume that no one inside those conditions could belong. But belonging does not require perfection. It requires recognition, familiar faces, repeated patterns, a sense, however fragile, that the world around you is known. And for someone like Timmy, recognition may have been one of the only stable forms of safety available. That is the first mistake outsiders make. They look at the structure. They judge the environment. They stop there. But a person does not disappear just because their surroundings are difficult to understand. Timmy was not an image placed inside a broken house. He was a human being moving through a system that made sense in ways outsiders never learned to read. He had patterns, preferences, reactions, ways of responding to people, ways of signaling comfort or discomfort. And those signals may not have looked like language to the outside world. But that does not mean they were not language. Because language is not defined by grammar. It is defined by meaning. And meaning can exist without words. That is where the misunderstanding begins. People see non-speaking and assume non-thinking. They see silence and assume emptiness. They see difference and assume absence. But silence is not the absence of experience. It is often the opposite. It is experience without an exit. Now consider what that means. It means Timmy may have felt far more than he could express in a way the world would accept. And that gap is not neutral. It is pressure, constant, accumulating, unreleased. Now think about something simple. Pain, a headache, a toothache, a stomach issue. Now remove the ability to explain it clearly. Remove the ability to say where it is, how strong it is, how long it has lasted, what makes it worse, what makes it better. Now ask what happens. The pain does not disappear. It stays. And over time, it becomes part of how others interpret you. Not as a problem to solve, but as a behavior to accept. That's just how he is. And that sentence carries more weight than people realize. Because hidden inside it are all the questions no one asked. All the adaptations no one built. All the possibilities no one explored. Now expand that beyond pain. Confusion. Fear. Hunger. Discomfort. Fatigue. Each one present. Each one real. Each one potentially unexpressed in ways others could decode. Now ask a difficult question. How much of a person's life can remain invisible simply because it cannot be narrated? Now return to the smile. because this is where the contradiction becomes sharpest. A smile is easy to understand. It requires no translation. It reassures the observer. It simplifies the moment. And because of that, it becomes dominant. It becomes the signal people remember, the signal people trust, the signal people build their entire interpretation around. But what if that signal is incomplete? What if it is only one piece of a much larger internal reality? Now the smile becomes something else. Not a full explanation, but a fragment. And when a fragment is treated as a whole, misunderstanding becomes inevitable. This is how public identity forms. Not from everything a person is, but from what is most visible, most repeatable, most easily shared. Timmy's smile became that. It traveled. It repeated. It stayed. And over time, it replaced the need for deeper questions. Who is he? What does he feel? What does he understand? What does he need? Those questions became secondary, because the image felt complete enough. And that is where the real loss begins. Not in the conditions, not in the environment, but in the reduction. A full human life narrowed down to a single visible trait. Now consider something else. Familiarity. Even in difficult environments, familiarity creates structure. Faces become anchors. Voices become signals. Movements become predictable. And for someone navigating the world without conventional language, predictability is not comfort. It is survival. Now imagine that world. Limited. Yes, but known. Now imagine it from the inside. Every object has a place. Every person has a role. Every sound has meaning. Not always pleasant. Not always stable. But recognizable. Now ask what happens when that recognition is disrupted. Because disruption does not need to be dramatic. It can begin with small changes. New faces. New rhythms. New expectations. And for someone already navigating a fragile system, those changes can accumulate quickly. Now consider how the outside world entered. Cameras, visitors, attention, each one carrying intention, but also carrying disruption. Now ask what that does to a person who relies on stability. It introduces unpredictability, and unpredictability creates strain. Not always visible, not always immediate, but present. Now step back, because this is the foundation of everything that follows. Timmy was not simply a man living in hardship. He was a man living inside a system of meaning that the outside world never fully learned to read. And when the world finally looked at him, it saw only the surface, the smile, the silence, the image. But beneath that surface was something far more complex. A life shaped by presence, by limitation, by endurance, and by a constant gap between what was felt and what could be understood by others. That gap is where the real story lives. And it is not easy to sit with, because it forces a question most people avoid. Not what Timmy was, but what it means to live a life the world never fully learned how to hay. Comment one word. Seen if you think the world truly understood him. Missed if you think it only saw the surface. Or unsure if you believe the truth sits somewhere in between. Because the next part does not move outward. It moves deeper, into what it means to feel everything, and still have no reliable way to make the world respond. Now the question becomes harder. Not who Timmy was on the surface, but what it means to live inside a body that feels, without a reliable way to explain what it feels. Because once you remove language, you do not remove experience. You remove access, and access is what turns feeling into response. Now imagine something precise. You wake up uncomfortable, not dramatically, not urgently, but something is wrong. Your stomach, your teeth, your head, your skin. You feel it. You know it. But the only tools available to you are sounds that others may not interpret correctly. Now ask what happens next. Do people understand? Do they investigate? Or do they interpret? Because interpretation is not the same as understanding. Interpretation is filtered. It depends on expectation, on habit, on what others believe is normal for you. And over time, those expectations become fixed. Patterns form. He always does that. She always reacts like that. That's just part of who he is. And slowly, something dangerous happens. Signals stop being questioned. They start being accepted, not as messages, but as traits. Now consider the consequence. Pain becomes personality. Discomfort becomes behavior. Distress becomes identity. And once that shift happens, the system stops looking for causes. It stops asking why. Now think about Timmy inside that structure. A non-speaking adult, living in an environment with limited access to medical care, limited access to specialized support, limited access to structured communication systems. Now ask a direct question. How many signals might have gone unrecognized? How many needs might have been partially met or misunderstood entirely? Now consider the weight of that over time. Not one day, not 1 week, years, accumulating, layering. Now think about something else. Choice. Language is not just about expression. It is about agency, the ability to say yes, to say no, to refuse, to request, to negotiate, to explain preference. Now remove that, not completely, but enough that others must interpret your choices. Now ask what remains. Dependency, not as a temporary condition, but as a constant. Now consider what dependency requires. Trust, and not abstract trust. Specific trust, in people who can read you accurately, respond consistently, adapt when needed. Now ask what happens when that trust is incomplete, or inconsistent, or overwhelmed by circumstance. Now the system becomes unstable, not intentionally, but structurally, because even care can become strained when resources are limited. Now think about the environment again, not as a background, but as an active factor. Clutter, noise, irregular routines, unpredictable patterns. Now ask what that does to someone already navigating without language. It increases cognitive load. It increases sensory pressure. It reduces clarity. Now consider how that might appear externally. Repetitive movements, sudden changes in mood, withdrawal, agitation, or even increased smiling in certain contexts. Now ask how those behaviors are interpreted. Are they seen as communication or as condition? Because that distinction determines response. Now return to the idea of translation, because that is what Timmy needed most. Not just care, not just presence. Translation, a system built around decoding his signals. Now consider what that system would look like. Consistent observation, pattern recognition, adaptive communication methods, time, patience, training. Now ask whether that system was fully available, because if it was not, then the gap remains, and the gap is where suffering accumulates. Now consider another layer. Medical care, something as basic as a checkup. For most people, it involves explanation. Symptoms described, questions answered. Now remove that pathway. Now ask how accurate the assessment can be. Now consider how easily issues can persist or go unnoticed. Now step back, because the story is not about one missing piece. It is about multiple gaps overlapping. Communication, care access, environment, support structure. Now when those gaps overlap, the result is not dramatic. It is gradual, a life lived with friction, constant, unresolved. Now consider the outside perception. People saw Timmy. They reacted, some with empathy, some with shock, some with curiosity. But very few asked the right question. Not what is wrong with him, but what does he need that he is not receiving? Because that question requires restraint. It requires uncertainty. It requires admitting that observation is not understanding. Now think about how often that step is skipped. Because certainty feels better. Labels feel complete, but they are not. Now consider the role of time. Because time does not solve these problems automatically. Time amplifies them. If systems are not adjusted, if support is not increased, if translation is not improved. Now ask what that means for Timmy's daily life. It means each day carried both familiarity and limitation, recognition and restriction, presence and absence. Now consider the emotional dimension, not as something we can define precisely, but as something we can acknowledge exists. Attachment, preference, comfort, discomfort, all present, even if not expressed in words. Now ask what happens when those internal states cannot be communicated clearly. They remain internal, but they do not disappear. Now consider the effect of that over years. Not dramatic, but cumulative. Now return again to the smile, because it becomes even more complex now. If much of what is internal cannot be expressed, then what reaches the surface becomes amplified. A smile becomes a stable signal, a consistent output, something that works, something that is received positively. Now ask whether that reinforces it, because responses shape behavior. If a smile is understood, if it creates positive interaction, then it becomes reliable. Now ask what that means. Not that it is false, but that it is selected, because it works. Now consider how that influences public perception. People see what is most visible, most consistent, most accessible, and they build the story around it. Now step back, because this is where misunderstanding becomes structural. Not because people intend harm, but because the system of observation is limited. Now ask a final question for this part. If a person lives a life where most of their inner experience cannot be translated clearly, and the world only responds to the small portion that can be seen, how much of that life remains unacknowledged? Comment one word. Known if you think most of his experience was understood. Hidden if you think most of it remained unseen. Or partial if you believe only fragments were ever recognized. Because the next part moves into something even more complicated. What happens when a life like this is suddenly placed under a global lens? And whether visibility actually brings understanding, or something else entirely. Then everything changed. Not inside Timmy, around him. Because there's a moment when a private life becomes public. And once that line is crossed, it does not close again. The cameras arrive. The attention builds. The story begins to move faster than the people inside it. Now ask what visibility promises. Help, resources, recognition, intervention. Those are the expectations. And sometimes they are real. Money can arrive. Support can increase. Conditions can improve. But visibility also brings something else. Unpredictability. Strangers. Opinions. Control shifting outward. Now consider what that means for someone like Timmy. A man whose stability depends on familiarity, routine, predictable signals. Now place him inside a system where new faces appear regularly, where interactions change, where energy shifts from quiet repetition to constant variation. Now ask what that does. It increases pressure, not necessarily visible. Not always immediate, but cumulative. Now think about the nature of attention. It is not neutral. It asks something in return. Not directly, but structurally. Stories need updates. Audiences need movement. Narratives need progression. Now ask where that pressure lands. On the people being observed. Now consider the contradiction. The same attention that can bring help can also disrupt the very stability that vulnerable people rely on. Now ask a difficult question. How do you balance those two forces? Because there is no simple answer. Now consider the people entering that environment. Some with genuine intent. Some with curiosity. Some with unclear motives. Now ask how those differences appear to someone who cannot easily distinguish intention through language. Now the environment becomes harder to read. Now think about control. Before attention, control is local, limited, but contained. After attention, control becomes distributed. Multiple voices, multiple influences, multiple directions. Now ask what that creates. Fragmentation. Now consider how that affects care. Consistency becomes harder. Boundaries become blurred. Now step into a specific moment. A camera is present. Timmy is visible. Now ask what he understands about that moment. Not in abstract terms, but in immediate experience. New person, new object, new energy. Now ask how he interprets it. Through pattern recognition, through reaction, not through explanation. Now consider how often that moment repeats. Again and again. Now ask what that repetition does. It changes the baseline. Now think about something subtle. Overstimulation. Not dramatic, not obvious, but continuous. Noise, movement, interaction. Now ask how that accumulates. Not as one event, but as a constant condition. Now consider what that might look like over time. Changes in mood, changes in behavior, changes in responsiveness. Now ask how those changes are interpreted. As personality, as condition, as normal variation. Now ask how often they are traced back to environment. Now step back, because this is where the story becomes uncomfortable. The line between help and harm becomes unclear. Not because anyone intends harm, but because complex systems do not respond predictably. Now consider another layer. Narrative. Once a story becomes public, it is shaped, edited, framed. Now ask who controls that narrative. Not the person at the center, but the people documenting it, discussing it, sharing it. Now consider Timmy inside that. A man without a voice in the conventional sense. Now ask how much control he has over how he is seen. Now ask how much of his identity is constructed by others. Now consider the weight of that, being seen by millions, without the ability to correct them. Now step into another shift. Intervention. Reports begin to circulate. Authorities become involved. Now ask what triggers that. Not attention alone, but patterns, risk, assessment. Now consider what that leads to. Removal. Separation. Now ask what removal means. Not just physical relocation, but disruption of everything familiar. Now think about routine again. Faces, spaces, objects. Now remove them. Replace them with new ones. Now ask what that does. It creates disorientation, even if the new environment is safer, cleaner, more structured. Now consider the trade-off. Safety versus familiarity. Now ask which one is easier to measure. Safety. Now ask which one is harder to measure. Emotional continuity. Now consider Timmy inside that transition. A new place, new people, new routines. Now ask how quickly adaptation happens. Not instantly, gradually. Now consider what reports suggest. Calmer behavior, more stability. Now ask what that indicates. That the new environment provides something the old one could not sustain. Now ask what that means about the previous environment. Not that it lacked care, but that it exceeded capacity. Now consider the emotional reaction of observers. Relief, but also discomfort. Because improvement raises a question. Why was it not like this before? Now consider the honest answer. Because conditions are not static. They change. They accumulate. They reach limits. Now step into the deeper question. What does it mean to be saved after years of adaptation to a different system? Because rescue is not simple. It is not just improvement. It is also loss. Loss of familiarity. Loss of known patterns. Now ask how that loss is experienced by someone who cannot fully explain it. Now consider something else. Time. Because adaptation works both ways. Timmy adapted to one environment over years. Now he must adapt again. Now ask which adaptation is easier. Neither. They are different. Now step back again. Because this is where the story refuses to simplify. The world wants a clean conclusion. Before and after. Problem and solution. But reality resists that. Now consider what remains. A man whose life was shaped by conditions he did not choose. A man whose identity was constructed by others. A man who moved from one system to another without ever controlling the transition. Now ask what we actually know. Fragments, observations, reports, but not the full internal experience. Now ask what that means. It means the story remains incomplete. Not because information is missing, but because some experiences cannot be fully translated from the outside. Now consider the final tension. Visibility increased understanding in some ways, but it also increased complexity. Now ask a final question for this part. Did the world truly get closer to Timmy through exposure? Or did it simply get closer to an image of him? Comment one word. Closer, if you think visibility brought real understanding. Farther, if you think it increased distance in a different way. Or both if you believe it did both at the same time. Because the final part is not about what happened to Timmy. It is about what his life asked from the people who watched it. Now everything narrows. Not the story, the lens. Because after everything has been seen, discussed, shared, and argued over, what remains is not information. It is responsibility. Timmy Whittaker does not leave behind a clear narrative. He leaves behind a question. And it is not a comfortable one. What does it mean to witness a life you never truly understood? Because that is the position every viewer eventually finds themselves in. You saw him. You recognized him. You remember him. But do you understand him? That is where the story changes. Because understanding is not built from images. It is built from limits. From knowing what cannot be claimed. From resisting the urge to simplify something that was never simple. Now consider what the world actually received. Fragments. A face. A smile. A series of moments captured and replayed. And those fragments were enough to create certainty. People formed opinions, explanations, judgments. Some compassionate, some harsh, some careless, some sincere. But all built on the same foundation. Partial access. Now ask what that means. It means the public version of Timmy was constructed from what was visible, not from what was complete. And visibility is selective. It favors what is easy to recognize. What is repeatable? What can be shared quickly? A smile fits that perfectly. It travels without explanation. It reassures without context. It allows the viewer to feel something immediate. But what it does not do is explain the life behind it. And over time, something subtle happens. The visible replaces the invisible. The fragment replaces the whole. Now the smile becomes the identity. Now the silence becomes the explanation. Now the person becomes the image. And that is where the deepest loss occurs. Not in what was shown, but in what was never asked. Because there were questions that remained. Always. What did he feel when he was uncomfortable? What did fear look like for him? What did pain look like? What did trust look like? What did he recognize? What did he prefer? What did he resist? These are not small questions. They are the structure of a human life. And yet most of them remained unanswered. Not because they did not matter, but because the system around him was not built to extract those answers clearly. Now consider the consequence of that. A life lived with depth, but remembered in outline. A person experienced in full, but represented in part. Now ask what responsibility means in that context. It does not mean filling the gaps with assumptions. It does not mean projecting emotions onto him to complete the story. It does not mean deciding that you understand him because you felt something when you watched him. Responsibility means restraint. It means acknowledging that there are parts of his life that remain outside your reach. Not temporarily, permanently. Now consider how rare that is. Because most narratives reward certainty. They reward conclusions. They reward clarity. But this story does not offer that. It offers something else. A boundary. And boundaries are uncomfortable. They force you to stop, to question, to admit what you do not know. Now consider Timmy again, not as an image, but as a presence. A man who lived for decades inside a system that did not fully translate him. A man who depended on others to interpret his needs. A man whose internal life existed regardless of whether it was understood. Now ask what that requires from the viewer. Not sympathy alone, not curiosity, but discipline. The discipline to separate what is seen from what is assumed. The discipline to hold complexity without forcing it into a simple frame. Now return to the idea of dignity, because this is where everything converges. Dignity is often misunderstood. People associate it with independence, with articulation, with control. But dignity does not depend on those things. It exists before them. It exists even when a person cannot advocate for themselves in conventional ways. It exists even when a person cannot explain their experience. Timmy did not need to explain himself to possess dignity. But the world often requires explanation before it recognizes it. And that gap is where many people are lost. Now consider the final contradiction. The world saw him, but did not build a system that could fully hear him. The world reacted to him, but did not fully adapt to him. The world remembered him, but may never understand him. Now ask what that means for memory. Because memory is selective. It holds on to what is clay, what is emotionally immediate, what is easy to recall. And in this case, that is the smile, the softness, the image. But if memory stops there, then the story remains incomplete. Now consider the alternative. Memory that questions itself. Memory that revisits what it thought it understood. Memory that acknowledges the gap between observation and reality. That kind of memory is slower, less satisfying, but more accurate. Now ask yourself what kind of memory you carry. Do you remember what you saw? Or do you question what you missed? Because that distinction determines whether Timmy remains an image or becomes a responsibility. Now consider something deeper. Timmy's life was not extraordinary because of what happened to him. It was extraordinary because of what it reveals. About systems, about perception, about how easily a human being can be reduced to what is visible, and how difficult it is to recover what was not. Now ask one final question. Not about him, about you. If you were placed inside a life where your thoughts could not be clearly expressed, where your needs depended on others interpreting you, where your identity was shaped by what others could see, would you still be understood? Or would you become something else in the eyes of the world? That question does not have a comfortable answer, and it is not meant to, because the purpose of this story is not resolution. It is recognition. Recognition of limits. Recognition of responsibility. Recognition that some lives cannot be fully translated into the language we are used to using. And that does not make them smaller. It makes our understanding incomplete. Now everything comes down to a single choice. How you hold the story. As an image. Or as a question. Comment one word. Image if what stays with you is what you saw. Question if what stays with you is what you now realize you did not see. Because the difference between those two is the difference between watching a life and learning from it. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.